This Parsha podcast is dedicated in loving memory and Lila Nishmas Chaiti Bas Menachem Mendel, the grandmother of our dear friend Ethan Weiss. Chaiti was a remarkable woman of tremendous strength and resolve and wonderful midos, wonderful character, and she passed away this week. May her soul be elevated in heaven. We are at the end of a wonderful book, the final installment of the book of Bamidbar. We have a double Parsha, a massive marathon double Parsha, Mattos and Masei. And would you believe it? Next week, we begin the final book of Devarim. I already have to start thinking about the next cycle of the Parsha podcast. Year 9 of the Parsha podcast is almost finished, and I don't want to jinx it, but we have a very important milestone coming up in a couple of weeks. As you may or may not know, when we started the Parsha podcast, it was a bit choppy. The first year we didn't miss a single week, but the second year we took a few weeks off, and then the third year was perfect, besides for 1 week, which I remember, Parshas Vayera. But then the fourth year, it was a more of a mixed bag, and it's been almost 5 years that we've had a perfect streak, not missing a single week. And we're about 3 or 4 weeks away from the 5th anniversary. It's a wonderful milestone. I don't want to jinx it, but please God, we're going to celebrate that together in a few weeks. But now we have to concentrate on Parshas Mattos and Masei, the 2 final Parshios of the book of Bamidbar. And there's a lot to talk about. It begins with the laws of vows and oaths and their annulments. And then we have a very long chapter on the war against Midian. You recall Midian, they were the ones who gave up their daughters to seduce the Jewish men and cause them to sin and cause them to do idolatry and led to the death of 24,000 in a plague. It's time to avenge this terrible crime. It's a completely lopsided result. We destroy our enemies without suffering a single casualty. We also get Bilam, the sorcerer and the schemer. He too is punished for his crimes. We have the laws of koshering vessels. The nation, they plundered Midian, and they came back with lots of pots and pans and all sorts of different items, and they had to be purged from their non-kosher residues. We have to learn the laws of how to do that. We have the very long and detailed description of the division of the spoils of war, a complete accounting of the booty and how it was dispersed amongst the nation. And then Parshas Mattos ends with the episode of the 2 tribes of Reuven and Gad. They both wanted to settle on the east side of the Jordan River. The nation, of course, is aiming to enter the land of Canaan, the land of Israel proper. You got to cross over the Jordan. But along the way, they conquered lots of lands on the east side. And these 2 tribes, they decide that they want to settle there permanently. And there's a whole back and forth, a whole protracted negotiation. Moshe says, well, you're not going to accompany your brothers. They're going to go to war. You're going to stay here. No, we'll join them for the war, but we'll settle down over here. We'll come back. And indeed, those lands and the names of those lands and the names of the cities, that's all detailed. And at the end of Parshas Mattos, Moshe placed certain conditions upon them. And indeed, in the book of Joshua, we read how those conditions were fulfilled, and those 2 tribes, eventually it's 2.5 tribes of Reuven and Gad and half of Menashe, they indeed joined their brothers in war, and they go back and join their families on the east side of the Jordan. That's Parshas Mattos, and the second installment is Parshas Masei. Masei means travels, encampments. It starts off with a comprehensive list of all the different encampments that our nation had in the wilderness from when they left Egypt up to this point when they are opposite Jericho. They're right on the banks of the river. There were 42 different places where the nation stopped. We have the instructions to cross over the Jordan, to conquer the land, and importantly, to vacate the land of its indigenous population. We have the boundaries, the borders of biblical Israel. We have the instruction to appoint representatives of each tribe who will represent their tribe in the division of the land. The Levites, they do not receive a portion of the land, but they receive cities that are scattered throughout the other tribal lands. Distributed throughout the land are cities that are reserved for the Levites. The Levites are the leaders of the people. They're the clergymen, and they have to be distributed everywhere. And those cities, the cities of the Levites, they double as cities of refuge for accidental, unintentional murderers. Someone murders accidentally, unintentionally. They are punished. They're not executed, of course. It was an accident, but they are punished by having to go to a city of refuge. And the 42 cities of the Levites, plus an additional 6 cities, the standalone cities of refuge, those are the places where those accidental murderers must go. And the Parsha ends, the book ends, with the final resolution of the episode of the daughters of Tzlafchad. You recall Tzlafchad from the tribe of Manasseh. He died without sons, and his daughters came and petitioned to inherit the ancestral lands of their father. And that story is closed at the end of our Parsha when those daughters are told, yes, you may inherit the land, but you must marry fellow members of the tribe of Manasseh so that the initial conveyance of the land is done entirely to a tribe. You don't have little pockets of other tribes, little enclaves of other tribes within the tribal lands of Manasseh. It's a marathon, double Parsha, 240 plus verses, all sorts of interesting subjects to dig into. But let's talk about one part, the cities of refuge. God forbid there's a murder, terrible, a disaster, a tragedy. There's someone who's dead. And that's not a crime that we can tolerate. And God forbid if there's an intentional murderer who killed willfully, that is a capital crime in our law. But what if it was an accident? It was a mistake. They were swinging the hammer, the axe, it slipped out of their hands, or the top of the axe head just spun off and killed someone. It's an accident. Well, nevertheless, the person must be punished. They're not, of course, executed. They go into exile. They have to move into a city of refuge. And if they leave the city of refuge, then the relative of the victim, the vengeful relative, can actually exact punishment and can kill the accidental murderer without repercussions. So the city of refuge serves 2 purposes. Number one, it's a punishment. You have to stay, you have to remain there. It's like a large jail, an open-air prison. But it's also protection. It's a refuge because once you leave the city, if the accidental murderer leaves the city, they are vulnerable to the vengeful relative. And they must remain in the city of refuge ad mos haKohen HaGadol, till the death of the high priest. When the high priest, the spiritual leader of the people, when they die, then all the accidental murderers who are throughout all the cities of refuge, the 6 standalone cities of refuge, and the 42 cities of Levites that double as cities of refuge, all those accidental murderers are free to leave. The death of the high priest, that triggers the release of the accidental murderers from the city of refuge. That's what we're told in our Parsha. And the Talmud memorably tells us that the mothers of the high priest would provide care packages to the accidental murderers. And the reason why they would do that is to dissuade the accidental murderers from praying that the high priest dies. You're forced to stay in the city of refuge. You want to leave. You want to explore the world. You want to go to the ball game. You want to visit Italy. But you're stuck. You're stuck in this city of refuge. An accident happened, but now you're stuck. And you're motivated to get out of your predicament. And you know, if the high priest dies, you're free to go. So there's a solution. You may be inclined, as unsavory as it may sound, you may be inclined to pray for the death of the high priest. But his old, wrinkly mother, she brings you cookies every Tuesday, and she would be so sad to see her son die. So you don't pray, at least you don't pray with enough enthusiasm to actually precipitate the death of the high priest. That's what the Talmud tells us quite memorably. But the general idea that the accidental murderer is freed from the city of refuge when the high priest dies, that's an idea, that's a connection that needs to be explained. It's not immediately clear why the death of the high priest in any way contributes to the release of the murderers, the accidental murderers, from their cities of refuge. What's the connection? What could possibly be the connection between the death of the high priest and the releasing of the accidental murderers? So, of course, this is a good question, a very basic question, and Rashi asks it, and Rashi offers two answers. One of them we've talked about in the past. Very important idea. A high priest, well, he's the leader of the people, and he's responsible for the entire nation, and any and all tragedies that befall the people are partially his fault. He's to blame for all tragedies that happen. Why? Because his jurisdiction, it covers the entire people. And any tragedy that happens in the nation's midst, it's partially his fault. He should have prevented it with his prayer. The mandate of the high priest is to be responsible for every single member of this glorious nation. And if something happens to one of them, and the high priest is not even there, he may not even be aware of what happened. He doesn't know what's happening in the forest where someone's swinging the axe and the blade gets dislodged. He doesn't even aware of that. Nevertheless, Talmud tells us, Rashi cites it, you did not do your job sufficiently well. If such a tragedy can happen to your people, you're partially at fault. And therefore, when the high priest dies, this is like the final punishment for all the responsible parties to this tragedy. So we could turn the page and the accidental murderer is released. That's one idea that Rashi tells us. I think it's a powerful idea, an important idea about the responsibility of a leader. It's not just to go do sacrifices and do the service in the temple on Yom Kippur. The entire nation and everything that happens to it and everything that befalls it, it's your responsibility. And if an accident can happen during your tenure, you are partially guilty. That's one idea. We've talked about it in the past. Today I want to focus on the second answer, the second rationalization that Rashi offers. Again, this is also from the Midrash. It's almost like the opposite of the first answer. The first answer is that, well, these two people, the accidental murderer and the high priest, they're both conspirators in this crime. That's the first that we mentioned. The second idea is that, no, they're opposites. The high priest and the accidental murderer are opposites, Rashi tells us, citing the Midrash. The high priest, he promotes life. The high priest is all about life. His prayers and his sacrifices, everything that he does on behalf of the people, it's about helping them live and flourish. And he is the diametric opposite of a murderer who takes away life. And these two are just not compatible. That's what Rashi says. They're opposites. Now, it's not clear what he's saying. Why exactly does the murderer get released with the death of the high priest? Rashi says, well, they can't be together, so they have to be separated from each other because they're opposites. But he doesn't fully spell out, okay, so why, when the high priest dies, does the accidental murderer go free? So the Maharal explains this idea, and what he says is an eye-popping insight. He says that the high priest and the murderer are opposites. One promotes life, and one caused death. And he adds a Kabbalistic dimension to it. in heaven, there's different angels. There's the good angel and the bad angel, and one of them comes from the good angel, one comes from the bad angel, and they're opposites. But then he explains, they're opposites, but they can both only exist with the existence of the other. And when the high priest passes, it must be that the anti-high priest changes as well. There's life and there's anti-life. There's the high priest and there's the anti-high priest. And they're balanced. There's the high priest and then there's the accidental murderer. When the high priest is eliminated, necessarily, the murderer must be eliminated too. There's no longer a murderer. There can't be because the high priest is gone. It has to be that the murderer is gone too. So that person is no longer a murderer. It can't be that you'll have an anti-high priest once the high priest is no longer present. These two are opposites, and if one is removed, necessarily the other must be removed as well. We had a high priest, and then it was possible to have an anti-high priest. But when we no longer have a high priest, it's simply impossible to have an anti-high priest. So there's someone who's in jail, allegedly for murder, but it can't be because we don't have a high priest. That person must be released. That's what the Maharal says. It's a very lofty idea. I think it's quite eye-popping. And as a quick aside, I will say, a few weeks ago we spoke about a teaching of our sages that tell us that with the death of the righteous, there's atonement. I think it's a similar idea. When there's righteousness, and there's so much righteousness, then there's the capacity or the possibility for sin, so to speak, to exist. There's like a counterweight to it. And therefore, the sin, the corruption, just simply cannot exist once the righteous person dies. So it must be forgiven. So it's a certain almost mechanical idea, mathematical idea. When there's something, there must be something else which is its counterweight. When the high priest is gone, the evil must be gone as well. There's always going to be a balance between two forces. The system is designed to allow for people to make choices. We call that free will. And it has to be that the two sides are balanced. And if one side is, let's say the side of holiness is vacated, it must be that the other side is also vacant as well. The Talmud tells us, God said as if, I created the evil inclination, I created the Torah as its antidote. The anti-evil inclination is Torah. And this is why our sages tell us that if you didn't have an evil inclination, you wouldn't be able to have Torah. We talk about Adam and Adam's sin often. And the result of Adam's sin was he got an evil inclination. And we always ask the question, well, why was Adam doing what he did? Like, what prompted Adam to make such a terrible decision? And the answer is that Adam knew exactly what the consequences of his action was, and he wanted it. He wanted that evil inclination because he knew that if he had the evil inclination, he would get something of equal power as a counterweight. He would get Torah. Adam wanted Torah, and he knew he could not get it without an evil inclination, so he bit the bullet. This is the idea that we've seen many places, and we'll go through some of the other examples of places we've seen this idea. There must be a balance. And if you eliminate something, necessarily, you will eliminate its counterweight. And if you will introduce something, like the evil inclination, necessarily, you will introduce its counterweight, you'll have Torah. And that's Adam's calculus. With the introduction of the evil inclination will come the necessary introduction of its counterweight, Torah. I remember hearing of a legendary bar mitzvah speech where the speaker was talking about this idea, and he told the bar mitzvah boy, I want to give you a big blessing. You should merit to have an enormous evil inclination. And that's a very strange thing to say. Why would you say that? This is the idea. The size and the potency and the power of the inclination, that will determine how big and how powerful the potential counterweight is. You want a lot of Torah, you have to realize there's a price you have to pay. There's a challenge you must overcome. There's a counterweight you must contend with. And the truth is, I will quibble with this speech because we don't seek to have an evil inclination, even though there's tremendous upside with having an evil inclination, and the bigger the better. Nevertheless, we don't actually pray for that. But we have to realize, if it is greatness that we are after, there is some version of anti-greatness, of equal size, of equal potency, that we must contend with. And those anti-greatnesses are confounding, are bothersome, dreadful, and absolutely positively necessary, because that greatness cannot exist without that anti-greatness. So we spoke about Abraham many times. If there was an Abraham, there must be an anti-Abraham. That's Nimrod. It's not possible to have an Abraham without a Nimrod. Oh, Moshe and Aaron, they too must have a counterweight. We call them Dathan and Abiram. It's not possible otherwise. When there was a conveyance of Torah to the Jewish people, when the Almighty handed over the tablets to Moshe, at that time there was a golden calf. It's not possible otherwise. When there's prophecy, there's a drive for idolatry. It's not possible otherwise. When there's a high priest, a life giver, there has to be an anti-high priest. It's not possible otherwise. If you remove the high priest, it's not possible to have the anti-high priest. Either with the death of the high priest, the murderer is released. This is the idea that the Maharal tells us. And I want to kind of bring this a little bit closer to home, make it a little bit more relevant to us. We understand the concept. There's got to be balance. That's the system that the Almighty instituted in the world. If there's an angel on one side, there's got to be an angel on the other side. If there's greatness, there's anti-greatness. It seems that this is true even within a single person. The Talmud tells us that Rabbi Akiva, who became the greatest sage of his era, who became the primary author of the Mishnah, someone who Moshe said about him, he is worthy to be the one who delivers the Torah to the Jewish people. But he started off his life, he started off his career as an ignoramus, as an Am Haaretz. Until he was 40, he was totally ignorant of Torah. And of course, he became a great sage and a great scholar and amassed many students. And the Talmud records that he told his students, Kishehayisi Am Haaretz, when I was an ignoramus, I used to say, if only, I wish I had a Torah scholar so I can bite him like a donkey. That's a very strange thing to say. Who speaks like that? Bite him like a donkey? So the student said, no, you're not supposed to say like a donkey. You're supposed to say, I'll bite him like a dog. So Rabbi Akiva responded, no. When a dog bites, it doesn't break any bones. But when a donkey bites, it bites and it breaks bones. And my animus and my hatred for the sages was so intense, was so strong, that I didn't want to bite them like a dog. I wanted to bite them like a donkey. Within Rabbi Akiva were two people. One of them that had such virulent hatred and animosity and animus towards the Torah and its sages, he wanted to break their bones. And the other version of that, the same person, was the greatest sage of his era and the primary author of the Mishnah. there wasn't really an average version of Rabbi Akiva. There was Rabbi Akiva that we know, and then there was this incredibly hateful anti-Rabbi Akiva, being just an innocent bystander who's apathetic was simply not an option. Do you recall perhaps how this book began, the book of Bamidbar? I think it was the second verse of the book. It talked about the census, the counting of the Jewish people. The book is called the Book of Numbers. It starts off with numbers, and we have multiple censuses. And you recall perhaps the word that the Torah uses to describe the counting. It doesn't say count, it says se'u, which means lift or uplift. And the Ramban in his commentary tells us that the word se'u, which means to lift or to uplift, it has two different opposing connotations. It could mean either to uplift to prominence, uplift the head of the Jewish people to prominence. It can also mean to lift the head off the shoulders, to decapitate. And the Midrash that the Ramban cites, it harkens back to Joseph and his cellmates. Does this ring a bell? Joseph and his cellmates? Joseph is in prison, and there's two cellmates, both former servants of Pharaoh, and they both have a dream, and they're both very despondent and depressed as a result of their dream. And one of them is told, you'll be restored to prominence, and one of them is told, you'll be beheaded. And in both instances, the verb that Joseph uses is the same verb that the Torah uses for counting, to uplift. The butler was told, Pharaoh will uplift you back to prominence, and the baker is told, Pharaoh will lift your head off your shoulders. And the Ramban says, when the nation is told that they are going to be counted, they're going to be uplifted, it's a way of saying, you will be uplifted, but you have to determine, does that mean you'll be brought to a place of prominence, like the butler, or will you be beheaded like the baker? What we're discovering here is scary. We're discovering that there are poles, so to speak, that balance each other out. There's the high priest and the anti-high priest, and the greatness and the anti-greatness, and the Moshe and the Aaron, and the King David and the Abraham, and its opposite. And that truly exists within a single person. There's Rabbi Akiva and the anti-Rabbi Akiva. And amongst our nation, there's the lifting and the uplifting, the prominence and the headlessness. We don't see much of a discussion about just being regular, being average, being mediocre. Our people are described like the sand and the stars. There really isn't a third option. And that's what the book begins with. It's a call, a mission, a clarion call to achieve greatness and the threat of beheading. And I think this is maybe a new framework for how to achieve great things. How do you motivate yourself to go after the exceptional things in life? How do you inspire yourself to seek something beyond the ordinary? We learn greatness is always paired with anti-greatness. Torah is always paired with an evil inclination, and the evil inclination is always paired with Torah. And there's a contrast, and there's a choice, the best version and the worst version. And when you realize that your pursuit of greatness is not an option, it's the only way really to flee from that worst version of yourself. The only way to avoid the beheading is to choose to be uplifted. The only way for Rabbi Akiva to not be someone who is a terrible person who wants to hurt and break bones of the innocent and break bones of the righteous is to become a great sage himself. This is a new way to motivate ourselves to achieve extraordinary things. We mentioned this in the past many years ago. King David composed a psalm to be read, to be sung at the inauguration, at the opening ceremonies of the temple. This is Psalm number 30. Of course, we know David did not build the temple himself. He prepared the temple. He left the blueprints for Solomon and all the materials and the land and a mandate from heaven to build it. But he was not allowed to build it himself. But he composed a psalm ahead of time for this day. And if you had to guess, what would David talk about in his psalm? Mizmor Shir, the song, Chanukah Sabais, for the inauguration of the temple. What's the appropriate thing to talk about at the inauguration of the temple? Maybe sacrifices or God's presence in our midst to highlight some of the great vessels, some of the awesome holiness to be found in this place. Almost none of that. It starts off, this is a song for the Chanukah Sabais, for the inauguration, for the dedication of the temple. And David says, I extol you, God, because you lifted me up, and you did not let my enemies rejoice over me. He's contrasting what I got, my closest to God, and what I avoided, the enemies rejoicing over me. I cried out to you and you healed me. I overcame my illness. You lifted me up from Sheol. What is Sheol? You don't want to know what Sheol is. It's one of the lowest pits of purgatory. You gave me life from falling down the pit. Now, what does this have to do with the inauguration of the temple? David evidently viewed his life as a binary choice. Am I going to be swallowed up by this pit, by this Sheol? Or am I going to build a temple? With that stark choice, he paved the way to building the permanent home for God in Jerusalem. Greatness is always matched up against anti-greatness. And that's true amongst the nation, amongst the world, even within a single person. We have to choose. You want to be uplifted? Oh, there's another way to interpret that word. The word Se'u es Rosh B'nai Yisrael, Se'u, lift, the head of the nation, can have a very different meaning. May we all choose wisely. And that brings us to our dilemma. Now, this dilemma needs a bit of setup. Someone kills accidentally, they have to go to a city of refuge. Well, there's 42 cities that are Levite cities, and those cities can absorb accidental murderers, provide safety and refuge for them. And there's 6 standalone cities of refuge, and there are some halachic differences between the two, between the full-blown cities of refuge and the Levite cities that double as cities of refuge. Regardless, in our Parsha, the location of those 6 cities are identified. Chapter 35. Verse 14, 3 cities placed on the Aver Hayarden, on the other side of the Jordan, on the Trans-Jordan, meaning on the east side of the Jordan. And 3 of them you put in the land of Canaan. Now, we don't know exactly where those 3 cities are, but if you open up the book of Devarim, chapter 4, you read that there are 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan. You recall this, there's 3 tribes, there's 2.5 tribes. There's the tribe of Reuven, tribe of Gad, and half of Manasseh. So the city of Betzer in the land of Reuven, well, that was one city of refuge. And the city in Gilad, for the tribe of Gad, that's the second city of refuge. And the third city in Golan, for the tribe of Manasseh, that's the third city of refuge on the east side of the Jordan. Now, of course, the Talmud tells us, even though the 3 trans-Jordan cities of refuge will not be activated until the other 3 on the west side are designated, nevertheless, Moshe, who loved mitzvos so much the way people love money, he loved mitzvos, he grabbed the opportunity to designate those cities. But here's the question, and the question will lead us to our dilemma. The settlement of our people was on both sides of the Jordan. There were 2.5 tribes of Reuven and Gad and half Manasseh on the east side of the Jordan River. We read about this Parsha, the whole negotiation back and forth. And then there are 9.5 tribes on the west side of the Jordan. So if you had to divide up 6 cities of refuge, what will be the balanced way to divide them? Well, if you have 12 tribes and 6 cities of refuge, that's 1 city of refuge per 2 tribes. Just some basic math. I know we don't do math in the podcast, but that one's pretty simple. So if you have 2.5 tribes, how many cities of refuge ought they to have? Well, you would say 1.25. But maybe you can't do a quarter, so it's either 1, maybe 2. You round it up, give them 2. But we don't see a reason why 2.5 tribes should have the same number of cities of refuge as 9.5 tribes. Maybe it should be 4 and 2, but it certainly should not be 3 and 3. So why are the cities of refuge so unevenly distributed? This is not my question. The Talmud asks this question, and of course, it's curated for us in Rashi. And Rashi gives us the Talmud's answer. Oh, in Gilead. Gilead. That's a city or a region in the tribe of Manasseh's territory. There were a lot of murderers. A lot of murderers in Gilead. It was the St. Louis of ancient Israel. No offense to our friends in Missouri. It was the south side of Chicago, the east side of Memphis. It was the murder capital of ancient Canaan. And therefore, you have to have more facilities for murderers. And that's the Talmud's rationalization for this imbalance. That's what Rashi says. That's what the Talmud tells us. Now, this raises all sorts of questions. First of all, it's like, why were there more murderers on the east side of the Jordan versus the west side? We imagine that our antecedents, these are righteous people. These are people that are Torah observant and obedient and very cognizant of Torah. Why would there be so many more murderers on one side of the Jordan versus the other? That's one question, but a more basic question. Let's accept Rashi's premise. There were more murderers on the east side of the Jordan, where 2.5 tribes resided, versus the west side. Why would that require more cities of refuge? A city of refuge is not a place for a willful murderer. It's a place for an accidental murderer. So, just because there are more murderers on one side, why should you have more cities of refuge on that side? That's the obvious question on what Rashi is saying. Now, there's many answers to this question. I want to focus on the answer to the question that provides us our dilemma. Gilead was home to many murderers. And that's why you have to have more cities of refuge. So the Maharal explains, because there were so many murderers in Gilead, the severity of the unconscionable crime of murder was diminished in the eyes of the populace, and therefore there were more accidental murderers. Now, what does it mean an accident? An accident means there's some degree of negligence. Accidents happen when people are more cavalier about human life. When you don't value human life so much, well, accidents are more likely to happen. When someone kills accidentally, they're punished. They have to go to a city of refuge. Why are they punished? It was an accident. Yeah, it was an accident, but maybe you should have been more vigilant. you're a bit negligent. Here's the calculation. When there are lots of murders, willful murders, that's going to cause people to value life less. Murders happen every day. It happens all the time. It's to be expected. And that leads to people devaluing human life, which leads to more accidents, which leads to more cities of refuge. That's the calculation that the Maral says. I saw a news story a couple days ago. It was a major announcement. A cause for an amazing celebration. New York City. There were no murders on July 4th. Did you see the story? July 4th. Not a single murder. Wow. That was celebrated. It was the first Independence Day on record without a murder in New York City. Unbelievable. Round of applause. And the police commissioner called it, listen to this quote, a historic and hopeful moment for all New Yorkers. What an amazing accomplishment. Bravo. Unfortunately, this self-congratulatory statement had to be walked back. And I looked it up. This is an actual tweet from Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch. It's an update. A man was dropped off at Brookdale Hospital by private means at 1:30 a.m. on July 5th. He was pronounced dead this morning. NYPD detectives just determined he was shot at 11:46 p.m. on July 4th. Alas, we still don't have a July 4th without a murder in New York City. We'll try again next year. That, unfortunately, is our society. Murder is common. It happens all the time. It's expected. It's just part of the course of human life. And that's like Gilead. There were lots of murders there too. And in such a society where murder is common, the value of human life gets degraded, and people will be less careful and less vigilant and less fastidious, and more actions will happen, requiring more cities of refuge. That's the explanation of why there are so many cities of refuge relative to the population on the east side versus the west side of the Jordan River. In Gilead, there are lots of murderers, and that caused a diminishment of the value of human life, and it led to an overrepresentation of accidental murderers, and therefore you need to have more cities of refuge. And this is a very interesting idea, and it's a scary idea. It's going to lead to our dilemma. The idea that we're told over here is that if someone has lots of exposure to bad things, they don't do it, they're just exposed to it. Those things become less severe in their eyes. It's like we saw in the Talmud. You see a sota in her disgrace, you have to say, well, now I've seen it, it could happen to me as well. I'm more accustomed, acculturated to this idea. It became more feasible to me, and therefore become a Nazir, don't drink any wine. Our attitude of how we react to a tragedy is that it's unthinkable. Imagine there were no murders, not in New York City, not anywhere in the country, not just on July 4th, but in all of July, and not just all of July, the whole 2025, not even a single murder in the United States. What would that society look like? Now, what if it wasn't just 2025? There hasn't been a murder in 50 years. What would society look like? If a murder happened, it would be so shocking. What, a person deliberately took someone else's life? And we're not there at all. Our society is completely on the other side of this. But if someone is not exposed to so many tragedies, the thought of a human life being snuffed out by another human, it's just unthinkable. The Talmud tells us that on the day before Passover. It's the busiest day of the year. Because every single Jew had to bring a sacrifice. Now, you don't have to bring your own sacrifice, but you have to bring a paschal offering. So there's millions of people coming to Jerusalem, potentially, to participate in the pilgrimage and in the paschal offering. And you imagine, like, what's it like? Tons of people, everyone converging upon this city, and just everyone being stuffed together. What happens when so many people get together? So Talmud says it never happened. There was a crowd crush that led to someone dying. Never happened. There was 1 year, one Passover in the times of Hillel, and there was one old man who, because of the jostling and the absolute sheer numbers of the crowd, he was crushed to death. And that Passover was forever known as the Passover of the crushed. That was the only story that everyone talked about, because it's just unheard of. Today there's people of a different religion that travel to Mecca for the Hajj, and routinely hundreds of people die in crowd crushes. Our people in the temple on Pesach, for hundreds of years, there wasn't a single disaster. And once there was one, that was the only thing people focused on, because it was so unheard of. In societies where tragedy and murder become normalized, it becomes a matter of routine. And when it's not normalized, when it's unheard of, a singular event where one old man dies is forever talked about and remembered. That really should be our attitude. A loss of life is a tragedy that's not in any way acceptable. But I think our society has become like the residents of Gilead. Like murder is just everywhere. Not just that, all sorts of tragedies that are liable to deaden our attitude and liable to make us accepting of these sorts of things. We're exposed to that every day. We're exposing ourselves to culture, to a society that devalues human life. Now, no one does this willfully, but that is the natural result. I think about, the terrible, terrible war that's been ongoing now for a year and a half in Israel. I remember, I think it was 1994, there was one Israeli soldier that was kidnapped by Hamas terrorists. He was hitchhiking. He was actually an American citizen, I believe he was. Nachshon Watzman. Watzman is how Israelis would say Watzman. Nachshon Watzman. He was hitchhiking, and these terrorists, dressed as Jews, picked him up, and they brought him to a location, and it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. Terrible. And I remember I was like 7 or 8 years old. And I remember everyone, the whole city, everyone getting together, and everyone reciting prayers and psalms for him. That's what it's like. It's your brother or sister of ours that gets taken by these monsters. But what happens when 1,200 of our brothers and sisters are slaughtered and 251 of them are taken hostage? And we read all about it, and of course we should. And it's been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of days. I think, unfortunately, we're guilty of going through the citizens of Gilead treatment. We become a bit calloused and insensitive to it. You read about, a soldier was trapped and died in Gaza. Five soldiers died, or a soldier entered a booby-trapped house and was blown apart, and we kind of get used to it. And we become desensitized to it. And it becomes routine. It's something you read with your morning coffee. We become citizens of Gilead. The head of the yeshiva that I was privileged to study at in Israel, in Jerusalem, one of the yeshivas I studied at, his name was Rabbi Shmuel Levitz. He already passed away before I was born, but his wife would censor the daily paper. She would cut out any news story that talked of any tragedy, because he would weep uncontrollably if he read about any tragedy. His heart was so sensitive. And once she didn't censor the paper. And the great rabbi, he cried nonstop. He wept for a half hour because there was an accident that killed several soldiers in Israel. That's the attitude we're supposed to have to tragedy. But when we get exposed to calamities and tragedies, and we see it every day, all day, we no longer are so sensitive to it. I think that's the downside of being exposed to what's happening in the world, and to media, and to news, to television. Like a death, a murder, things like tragedies, it's just part of the news. And if it bleeds, it leads. And it's just such a common part of the modern experience. Crime is sensational. It gets the eyeballs. And the most jarring thing will make the headline. And what that does to us is that it makes the most untouchable, intolerable, unimaginable crimes, well, we get exposed to it, and it becomes more tolerable in our minds. And I wouldn't say that any one of us are guilty of trying to mimic a crime, but we're all going to be impacted by it and desensitized by it. And the dilemma that I don't really have an answer to is what to do about this. Because if you just open up any newspaper, any news site, and just scan the headlines, it will invariably contain some description of a tragedy, of human suffering, of death, of destruction. 200 people died here, 150 over here. There was an earthquake, a flood, a tsunami, a crash, a fire, a plane that crashed. We are exposed to so much of that, and that causes us to lose our sensitivity to human life. But what's the alternative? We're trained to recognize, to believe that we're responsible for the whole world. 3 times a day, the Almighty expects us to give Him our opinion as to how He ought to run the world. That's the definition of prayer. God says to us, I want you, fragile, fallible, mortal human, give me your opinion about what I should do in the world. That's what prayer is. We have to know what's happening. We have to know where the world is holding. We have to know what the world needs. If we are, so to speak, God's advisors, how can we be ignorant about what's going on in His world? So the intractable dilemma that I don't have a good answer for is that if, as we learn over here, exposure to murder and to terrible things are bad for you, it's harmful for you, how do you fulfill your national mission and destiny when exposure to what has happened in the world, exposure to the news and to the media, can lead us to become less sensitive to human life, and that's not tolerable. Gilead was the murder capital of ancient Canaan, and when there is murder, there are accidents that mandate that you have to have lots of cities of refuge. Why? Because life becomes less valued. How can we know what we need to work on, what ought to be on our docket as advisors, so to speak, of God, as members of the kingdom of priests and holy nation? How can we know what the world needs, know what challenges face us, face our people, face humanity, yet not become desensitized by all the pain, all the suffering, all the tragedy that comes along with being informed? How can we be aware of the problems facing the world without becoming citizens of Gilead? That is an interesting dilemma, and one where I don't know what the answer is. I will tell you that I come from a family of people that are very interested to know the news. Very interested. I don't know if we're called news junkies. That has like a negative connotation. But this is already going back a few generations. There's a desire to know what's happening. And my wife, she comes from a very different background. She's not interested at all. Not curious. So I have to tell her when there's like important news stories that she has to know about. But otherwise she wouldn't know. There's her family, her job, responsibilities, and so on. And it's a more pleasant life because you're not exposed to all the craziness that's happening in the world. You don't know the drama and the gore of Gilead. You know nothing about it. So you retain your sensitivities and you don't get calloused and you don't become desensitized. And it's a beautiful thing. And you know what? It might be the way to go. It might be the way to go. But it's an interesting dilemma. Exposure to the world is necessary and harmful. And what to do about that? I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Send me an email, rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. What a delight to wrap up the book of Bamidbar together here on the Parsha podcast. It's year 9 of the Parsha podcast. We're about to get to, I guess it's called the stretch run. The stretch run of Devarim. Deuteronomy, please, God, with the help of the Almighty next week. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, an amazing and meaningful and powerful and uplifting, the good version of uplifting Shabbos upcoming. And please, God, we will talk again next week. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.